Hi everyone and welcome to the third edition of Tutorial Tuesdays. I'm Jake and today I'm going to show you how to make a health bar. There are three different versions here. One's this little radial one that'll follow the character as he moves around. Then there's just a plain linear health bar here. And then there's kind of a Diablo style health orb. And this could be used for mana, health, experience, whatever it is you want to use it for. These two will change color as they decrease. Right now I've just got it set up to decrease by key presses, and so basically that's the effect that we're going to go for. And you'll notice that this one, even when this guy runs around, doesn't rotate with him. You'll see why I did that in the tutorial. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm just going to go ahead and delete everything that I've got so far. At least the scripts, so we can make those again. I'm going to remove everything from the scene. And basically, to set up, just if you're going to use your own health bars, then you've already got those and you're good to go. If you want to use the same ones that I've got in the tutorial, then you can download them from the links below in the description. The health orb came from Pixabay, though I modified it so that the kind of shine that you see there on the orb is separate from the fill itself. So to set up, you're going to want to import the standard Unity package. Basically, I'm not going to do that, but you can go in here to import package, then characters. It'll come up with a little prompt, and just hit import when that comes up. I've also just made this new material, which I've done by create material, and that's just for the floor that we're going to create here, just so that it's a little easier to look at than the plain white that's made by default. So first thing we're going to do is create a 3D object to give our character something to stand on. It's going to be a cube. If I find it here, I'm just going to stretch this out so that our character has something to stand on. I'm going to apply this material. I just went in and selected this color picker here and made it a little bit darker for our character to stand on. We're going to bring out our third person character controller, which, like I said, is part of the Unity standard assets. If you go down into prefabs, third person controller, and drag it out, let's see if we can find him. He's way over here, so our cube is in the middle of somewhere, so I'm just going to reset that, and I'll just stretch that back out, move our third person controller up a little bit so he's standing on the cube. So then we're ready to go ahead and get our UI set up. So the first thing we're going to want to do is just go UI and image. When you do this, it'll create a canvas for you automatically. This is going to be our health orb, and it's going to be the fill. I'm going to duplicate this, and then I'm just going to create an empty game object. And the way I duplicate it is that just the shortcut's Control D to duplicate the object. And I'm just going to create an empty object to put this in, and I'm going to call it orb. That's really just for organization. You don't really have to do that. So that's the fill. This is going to be the health orb background. So I'll select the fill, go over here to sprite, and select the orb fill. Then I'll go over here to orb BG and select the orb transparent sprite here. And if we find our canvas, we can see that these are here, not really where we want them, kind of in the middle of the screen. So I'm going to scale both of these up. That's not what I want. If you hold shift, it'll scale them uniformly. I want to do them both at the same time. Something like this. Just move them to this side of the screen. So there's our health orb set up. And just a note that when you basically, to bring those in, just select them, drag them over to Unity, drop them into wherever you want them to go, and Unity will import them. And then when you go in here, these are PNGs and they have transparency. And basically you want to do this with any UI element anyway, and just change texture type from texture, which is the default, to sprite, 2D, and UI. So there's our orb, that's set up. And what you're gonna, the key to this when you're using a, actually this should be moved over as well. I should have scaled that whole thing. I'll reset this, because this would cause some scaling problems if you try to deploy this game to different resolutions. Orb. And then I'll scale this up. Scale this, and this up. And we'll reset the position to be 0 in the parent, something like that. Looks okay. And then here's the key, is on the fill, you'll want to change the image type. And for the case of the orb, well, for all of them, we'll want it to be filled. And this one is going to be a vertical fill. It's going to fill from the bottom up. And if we just kind of drag this fill amount, we can see that Unity just masks that for us nicely. So that health bar is pretty much already set up. We just need a way to control that. But we'll set up our other fill bars as well. So if we go to UI again, we create another image, and we'll call this one health bar, and this will be the fill. We duplicate this one again, we'll call this the BG. And in order for this fill to work, you have to actually select a sprite, because you see that fill option isn't available unless you select a sprite. So for this one, I'm just going to use one of the built-in ones, button spacebar sprite. And the image type again is going to be filled. This time it's going to be horizontal. The fill origin is left, so you can see that if we hide this guy there, now you can see that that's filling. But we're going to want this to start out as full red, and we'll re-enable the BG. And actually, stacking order inside of a canvas matters, so the lower it is, the further in front it is. So if we move the fill in front of the BG, you can see that that now shows up. And if we do this, we can see the background behind it. We're going to take this and move it over here, and just stretch that out, something like that. If we look in the game, that looks okay. And so we've got, let's see, I'm not going to bother nesting those inside of a parent. That was just kind of to show you for organization. And the last one, we're actually going to want a separate canvas, and for this one we're going to want it to be on our player. And this might seem a little bit weird, and there's a little bit tweaking you have to do to make it work, but this is basically how you get that effect that I showed you. So again, we go UI, we'll create an image that will create the canvas for us, although that created it on inside of our existing canvas. So let's do this. UI, and then we'll create the canvas manually as a child of the third person controller, and then inside here we'll create another image. This will be our radial, and we'll just select this radial that I've got here. And now it's set to screen space overlay, which is the default, which is generally what you want for a UI, but for this case we're going to want it to be world space. We can get rid of this graphic raycaster because we're not going to be using it for that, and we'll change this to radial, and then we can set this again to filled. This is going to be radial 360. Let me just get this shrunk down. Let's reset this, and we'll shrink this down quite a bit more. Look at it a little closer. We're going to want this at a rotation of 90, and we'll want to move it up just slightly so it's above the floor. And again, we'll shrink it down quite a bit more so it's just kind of a little circle around our player. Something like that works. And now I can show you how this radial works. Again, it's just this fill amount, and it'll go around like that. And you can set this however you like, but I like it to be at the top and not clockwise. I just think that seems to make a little more sense. So also we'll want this one to start out as red. So this one and the health bar fill are both going to change color when we do stuff. And actually we don't want these to be red. We want them to start out as green. My mistake. So 0 there. So green is good, red is bad. So we've got that set up. If we look at our game view, we've got 3 different kind of health readouts, and we're ready to go ahead and start coding. So I'm going to go ahead and right away on our radial, on our fill, on our health bar fill, and on our health orb fill. I'm going to add a new script, and we'll call this health bar. And actually, it probably makes sense for this to actually be stat bar, because it could be used for experience or mana or any other kind of stat you might have. So now that we've got the script open, we can start actually making stuff happen. So we're going to be working with images for this, so we're going to have to import a namespace. So we'll say using unityengine.ui, and that'll give us access to the image class that we're going to need. And so we'll need a reference to an image, which is going to be our fill image in all cases. So we'll say private image, fill image. We just say fill. We're also going to need a color, which we'll use to change the color of our health bars if we choose to do that. So we'll say private color. And just a note about color, and there's also a type color 32. Color 32 is the RGB representation using the values you might be used to in, say, CSS or HTML, where white is 255, 255, 255. If you just use the color type, which is better for our case here, then white is just a value of 111. So 1 is the max value and 0 is the min value. Then we're also going to need a, let's see here, a boolean. So bool, and we'll just call it change color, so that you can use the same script for different types of health bars and change the color if you want, and don't change the color if you don't want. So let's see, we can go ahead and get started with this now. In the start, we'll say fill equals get component, not that, my keyboard switched to French there, get component image, so that will get the image component in the game object that this script is attached to. So if we look at our game object here, each of these have an image attached as well as this script, so this will get this component from the same game object. Close this. Then we will say color equals fill.color. So this is going to get the current color of that fill image when it starts. Then we're going to want to say, I don't think we're going to need an update method, but we will need a method called update stat bar. So we'll say public void, because it's not going to return anything, update stat bar. And the way I'm going to write this is so that we don't need to have any concept about what stat the bar represents. That'll be handled by whatever script actually handles that stat. So if you've got, a player stats class that has health and mana in it, then when those decrease, you can call this method inside of the stat bar class, and you can just pass in the current stat value and the max stat value, and it will just work. Since all of these sliders go from 0 to 1, if we look here, the fill amount goes from 0 to 1. We can get that as basically a percentage of any stat given its current stat value and the maximum value that it can have. So if we pass that in, we can say fill, remember that's our image, we'll say .fill amount. That's going to access this value here, and we're going to assign it to equal the current stat value divided by the max stat value. So because the current stat value will always be less than max stat value or equal to it, so say max stat value is 100. If current stat value is 100, then 100 divided by 100 equals 1, so that will be a full fill value or fill amount. Say it's 50. 50 divided by 100 is 0.5, so that will give you a half full fill amount. So that's how that simple equation works. And that's basically pretty much it for that. But then we'll also want to say if change color. So this is something we're going to change in the inspector. So if we're changing the color, then we'll also do these steps. We'll say color dot green equals fill amount. So if it's 1, then it'll be a full value of green. If it's 0, then there'll be no green in the color whatsoever. And then we'll say color.r equals 1 minus the fill amount. So basically what this is going to do, I'll have to say fill.fill amount. What this is going to do is as the bar becomes more full, then there'll be more green. As it becomes less full, there'll be less green and more red. So we start with a value of 1, we subtract whatever the fill amount is. If the fill amount is 1, then R is going to be 0 because 1 minus 1 is 0. If the fill amount is 0, then the R is going to be 1 because 1 minus 0 is 1. If it's 0.5, then 1 minus 0.5 is 0.5, so you kind of get it. And so if red is 0.5, this will also be 0.5, and you'll get equal values of red and green, which will give you a yellow value. So that kind of makes sense. It goes from green to yellow to red, and that's handled just by this. And the last thing we'll need to do is say fill.color equals color. So that might be a little confusing, but we're accessing that image, taking its color, and overwriting it with the color that we've created here. And that's pretty much it for this class, I believe. But in order to actually get it to do anything, we're going to need to test it. So you would actually do this by making calls to update stat bar in your class, whatever you have written. But I'm going to do it just by writing a tester class and controlling it through keystrokes. So we can close all this stuff. We've got everything set up. And I'm just going to create an empty game object. I'm going to call it test object, and then I'm just going to create a temporary class called tester, and say we'll reload all. Okay, so we're going to need a reference to all of the health bars in the scene. And again, this is just a tester. This is not how I recommend you do it for an actual game, because it's going to be really inefficient and really only good for testing. But we're going to need to have a private array. So we'll say of stat bar, we're calling it. And to call it an array, we just give these square brackets, and we'll call it stat bars. And then in our start function, we'll say stat bars equals game object dot find objects of type. We pass in the type here. It's going to be stat bar. And now this is going to return an array of stat bars, and you can actually see that if I do this. Stat bar. So this is the return type. It's a stat bar array, which is exactly what we've got up here, and that's what we want. That's great. So now we've got all the stat bars here, and now we're ready to since this is a mock stat class, we'll say it'll be health. So we'll say public float max health, and we'll set it to say 100 by default, and then we'll say private float current health. And we don't need to assign that right now, but in the start we'll want to say current health equals max health. And then on our update, we're just going to want to decrement our health and then make calls to that stat bar function to update the bars to correspond to what our health is. So let's go ahead and do if input.getKey, and we'll use getKey because that will return true as long as the key is held down, whereas getKey down will only return true in the frame where it's pressed, so that we don't need to keep pressing the button to remove health. And then we'll say getKey, and we'll just say keycode.q because that's not currently used by anything. Then we'll say current health minus equals, what are we going to subtract by? Well, let's also get a health change rate. So we'll say public float health change rate, and let's by default set that equal to 20 F, just because that's good practice. And then I shouldn't say just because it's good practice. It'll accept 20, but if you say 20.0, it'll give you this thing. It'll say cannot implicitly convert type float, so you need to use the F suffix. So anytime there's a decimal after your number, you need the F. So it's good practice to just always put the F, even if you don't need it, because it will accept that whole number of 20. But we'll just put F, so it knows you want a float. So current health minus equals, so we're going to subtract the health change rate times time.delta time, just so that it changes the same on each frame, or it changes the same regardless of frame rate, I should say. And I say else if input.get keycode.e, we'll say, to increase it, we'll say current health plus equals health change rate times time.delta time. So now we're subtracting and increasing the health, but we're going to also need to update, call that update function in our stat bars. So we can say for each stat bar, that's the type, and we'll name it stat bar for this for each loop. And so for each stat bar in stat bars, sorry, for every stat bar that exists inside of the stat bars array, we will say stat bar dot update stat bar, and we'll pass in the current health and the max health. And now that should have everything wired together, and this is, again, like I said, just for testing. And why I said it would be really inefficient is because every single frame here, we're going to go through every stat bar and do the update stat bar, which really isn't the best way to do it. You'd want to do that whenever your health changes or your mana changes or whatever changes, rather than every single frame. And you'd want to do it for a specific stat bar, not all of them, most likely. So now we can go in and we can have a look at this, and hopefully, if we've done everything right, everything will work here. So if we press Q, everything goes down. See, our colors aren't changing on those two, and that's simply because we haven't, in our radial or in our health bar fill, set the change color option to true. Now if we do it, we should see our options, or our health bars, turn yellow and then red as health decreases. Notice that this one doesn't change because we've left that option unchecked, and because it's not a white image to begin with, that wouldn't work well anyway, and because this image is mostly red, it would just wind up black. So anytime you're doing something like this where you're modifying color, you'll probably just want to start with white, some kind of a white sprite, and let Unity handle the color. And I guess I'll just show you that. The radial, or sorry, the orb fill, if we say change color, it's just black when it's full. As it decreases, it does become more red, but we want it red by default anyway, so that's kind of not what we want. It's subtracting all the red from the color, which is why it's black, because that was the only color there to begin with. So that's not what you want. You want a white sprite if you're going to be manipulating color in most cases, or at least an image with a lot of white in it. So that's that, and that's pretty much done. However, there's one small thing to make this radial work a little bit better. As we walk our character around, everything seems fine and dandy at first glance, but if we start subtracting health, the position of the fill is just as important as the color to let you know how much he has. If you start turning like this, it becomes a little bit less clear to the player how much health they have, especially if it's decreasing as they're moving around. It gets harder to tell exactly what's going on. So if you like that effect, you can just leave it. However, I don't really like that, so we're going to need to stop this radial fill from rotating with the parent. This could be done a number of ways. You could say, rather than having this nested to the parent, rather than having this nested to the parent, you have it outside, and then you just have it follow its position by setting it manually each frame. That's a little more difficult than what I'm proposing, which is just to stop the rotation. So if we go to stat bar, and we can say private transform parent. So we're going to get the parent. We don't really need this variable, but it just make everything a little bit cleaner and easier to read as we get further into the code. And then we'll say private quaternion rotation. And then what we're going to do is when this starts, we're going to want to take the rotation that it is currently at and store it inside of this rotation variable. So we'll say transform.rotation. So what this is going to do is look at the transform of the object that this is attached to and take its current rotation, and it actually gets that, as you can see here, in world space. I can't go over that to show you, but it says the rotation of the transform in world space stored as a quaternion. So it's not going to pay any attention to the parent. It's going to get that rotation in world spaces, which is exactly what we want. So now we have that stored, and we could even put an option in here and say actually we want to do this to the parent, which is the actually, do we even need to do that? I think that's the way I did it before, but I don't think I need to do that. Don't need this parent at all. I could be wrong. I might wind up needing that back again. We'll say rotation equals transform.rotation, and then we can say, we could put another boolean in here, change color, and we could also say stop rotation. And this will actually work for all of them because the UI components aren't going to rotate anyway, so this isn't going to hurt anything really. But here we go. So we'll say update stat bar, and actually we'll need a late update function here so that this happens after all physics calls and everything else. So we'll say void late update. If you've never used this before, you're not familiar with it, it's literally exactly the same as the update function, but it happens later, obviously. So all of the physics and stuff like that I think happen either during or shortly after update, but late update happens after all of that. So anything you put in late update will kind of execute last after everything else. So we will say transform dot rotation equals rotation. So we're just setting it back to what it was when it first started, so it never ever has a chance to rotate, and if it does, we revert it back to this. But we only say if what do we call that? Stop rotation. If stop rotation, then transform.rotation equals rotation. So we'll reset that. Something's not happy here. Let's see. What are we not closing? Says it's expecting. What's it expecting? Another one of these for what? Oh, for the class. Right. So now, if we go back in here and we just hit play, we won't bother changing that stop rotation just yet. We'll just see what it does by itself. And let's actually not maximize on play so we can see the inspector as we play. So nothing seems to be happening. If we do this, this is still rotating as it was before. None of the other ones are broken, so that's good. If we say stop rotation, let's see, looks like it's still rotating with our character, which is not what we want. So perhaps we actually do want to do this to the parent. Let's see here. Let's just try. Oh, it's because I'm on the orb, actually. So if we go to our radial and hit play. So again, rotating as it was before, and if I hit this stop rotation now, I suspect it'll snap back to where it was before. Yep. And if we move around now, that stays in the same position. I think that makes it a little more easy to read for the player. Maybe it doesn't look quite as cool, but I think it is more functional that way. But anyway, that's it. You've got 3 different types of health bars here. You can easily customize this to make different types. Note that this script really is only made if you're going to be modifying the color for red and green. You could swap the values so that it's red when it's full, or you can use any of the pure RGB values to get, teal or magenta or red or orange, or any of those things. But if you want to have custom colors, you're going to need to modify that script a bit. But you should just be able to drag and drop this onto any kind of health bar that you have in your game, whether it's in world space like this radial is, or on your canvas, and it should just work if you go ahead and make calls to that update stat bar function from whatever stat management class you have. So I'll include links to both this tester class and the stat bar class. This probably won't be of much use to you, but it'll be there anyway. This is kind of what you really want. And so hopefully you found this tutorial useful and you're able to make your own stat bars now. If you did like it and you want to see more, please subscribe, as I'm posting these videos every single week. Check out the other videos on the channel. They're also good. Great even, I might say. And I've also got a trailer for my upcoming game, Pixel Zombie Shooter, which will be released at some point this week, I believe. So stay tuned for that. Also check out our Facebook page. And if you have any questions about what I did here in the tutorial, feel free to write a question down below in the comments. I will answer it. If you have any suggestions or there's a tutorial that you'd like to see, also feel free to make that suggestion. Because it's not always easy coming up with ideas for things that you can make fairly quickly in Unity, so any suggestions are appreciated. Share it with your friends, like Fidelum Games on Facebook for more tutorials and news about upcoming game releases. And thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.